Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the first of this series of kitchen table talks hosted by the Centre for Pagan Studies in conjunction with a number of other organisations and individuals. Today we have the wonderful Richard Levy, who is a practising magician with an academic background in philosophy and theology. He has given a range of talks and also performs oral storytelling. Today, the subject on which Richard will be speaking is entitled Revelations of the Labyrinth, the Mind of the Magician. This talk looks at the role of the mind in magic in terms of as an instrument. Instinctual, I've just lost my sight. Instinctual magic and the hidden depths of the mind and creative powers we can draw out.
Thank you, Matthew.
I hand over to Richard.
Awesome. So just to start, can I just confirm you can all hear me? This is clear?
Yep.
Okay. So to start with, I was actually, this talk came about because the Doreen Valente Foundation posted a quote of sorts from Doreen talking about the magic of the mind, and particularly of the intellect. And what I thought was
I muted
Richard.
Blaming hell. Sorry.
Can you hear me again?
Yes. No, can you hear me now?
Sorry.
Okay,
Right, okay.
So I'll just backtrack a bit, but I'll say it quicker maybe. When the Doreen Valente Foundation posted the topic of Doreen discussing magic of the mind, I was asked to do a talk about it, and I thought it'd be an interesting subject, especially because I will actually be honest, as much as the mind is a very important, obviously, part of magical practice and work, it's also something which I sometimes feel, because of the input of modern psychology, becomes far too much of a focus. And I think it's important that before I start this, I mention that to the way I kind of would see things, and obviously there's a degree here which is going to be an opinion, obviously, because that's how we work. Consciousness is physical as much as it's mental. It's part of our body and part of our minds. And magic is the same. It's physical, it's mental, it's spiritual, it's not all those spheres. When I think of the gods, it's the same thing. The gods are part of nature in the physical realm. They are part of higher realms of consciousness, and they are part of within us. And that sort of multi-dimensional approach is important. But as a result, everything we do, therefore, is important. So how you engage physically with something is important, and how you engage mentally with it is important. So to start with, I have divided this into looking at this in three ways. The first being as an instrument, the mind as an instrument in magic. The second is the level of it that's instinctual as well. And the third is looking more at the deeper or hidden depths. So in terms of an instrument, I would say that I think the first thing that is often taught or someone has to learn to do, just as the first key to open the door of magic, is actually stillness. To be able to still the mind. And I think we even do that without even giving it that word anymore. You know, when you're shuffling your tarot cards, you still your mind for a moment and you focus on your question, and it's the same throughout. So I would say that, in my opinion, often when we're doing spell work, divination, and magic, your core is still, and that's the same if you're a martial artist, if you're a dancer, it's the same thing in that art. It's a physical discipline. Your core is still, your mind is focused, and your hands are busy. Stillness and focus are those sort of key features, and they have depths as well. And I remember when a friend of mine, who's a very interesting magician, she's produced some books and some works, and she was talking about working, in this case, with the power of the void. And in one of her visions, she said, "Now deepen your connection." And I could not tell you in words what that means, but because I've experienced it, I know what she meant by that. And it was an interesting moment when I realized that, yeah, I know exactly what to do. Thank you for the instruction, but I would not be able to relay that to someone in words very well. And the other very important thing here also is, of course, visualization and imagination. Visionary magic, I think, is actually something that we neglect quite a lot, not as individuals or in our traditions necessarily, but in terms of when you look at it in a broader aspect, in terms of what gets included in books, it tends to get given a kind of vague reference or maybe even a small chapter, but it's actually a very important part of what we're doing. And usually what that is denoting is a direct connection to the inner worlds. Ritualization is your externalization of that, but the connection to connect to power, that is all in, generally speaking, inner processes such as visionary magic. And imagination is therefore a tool that we use to create an interface. So I don't think many of us necessarily think that we're going to go out and see a very good example. Like, you know, you don't go out to see the god Pan as he's depicted. What that is a relationship, an engagement. Is what's happening when you think of Pan, of course, is he's half beast, half human. And I would say, in my opinion, what's actually happened there is you have an interface. I know some people believe that the gods are maybe very powerful thought forms. I don't. I don't think they're just psychological things, and so I can only really go off that. But what I do think is the mind and your imagination is there as a magical tool, and what it's telling you is this is a power from nature. So the animal aspect comes through, but is connected to humanity. So the human aspect comes through, and we are. And it's not us saying this is what you are. It's saying it's coming together. It's a vocabulary. It's a language. It's an engagement. It's not just about this imposing idea that humans get to say what they are. It's them telling humans what they are through the use of how we structure all these imaginary patterns. Imagination today has become this thing that just is almost seems nonsensical. Or used this way that's fantastical, but as a magical tool it's very different. And I would say that in terms of magic, it's very much often about how we are engaging with our environment, within ourselves, and various things, and all that carries on. And that even goes, so as I said, there's different depths to this. Simple, when you simply have your first intention to do a magical working of any kind, it started, you've initiated the process, and that's your mind getting the idea together. It's sort of thought made manifest in its earliest form. So there's a lot going on there, but essentially when I talk about this then as an instrument, what we are seeing here is a tool within ourselves that we can finely tune to assist us in magical work. And of course, as we do that, we can then explore various depths of it and what we are capable of doing. The example that the foundation gave, that Doreen mentioned too, one was what's referred to as the cone of power, and the work that was done obviously in World War II, which I'll briefly mention to people who don't know, and the other being weather magic. Now, cone of power is rather specific, I think, to the development that happened within the tradition of Wicca, which was in performing a circle dance and direct intention, you would gather power together, which would then have to be given obviously its purpose and structure, which in this case was a cone, and that would then be directed out, which was done very famously, of course, around World War II, which was to keep the Germans so they couldn't invade, and of course they didn't, so fair play. Of course, that wasn't the only magic that was going on. Dion Fortune was doing a lot of work as well. And the thing I would raise there is Dion Fortune's work was quite heavily visionary, because the people that she was working with couldn't meet. There was still some ritual going on, but there was a lot of visionary stuff going on when you read her letters. But of course, what we are seeing there is the ability to use mind to take and shape power that's being generated by various means. And the other thing she mentioned is weather magic. Now that's very interesting, because that does vary in different landscapes. You can see that based on the ritual and folklore, I suppose, as well, from different cultures, how they approach weather magic. Now in England, it's interesting that we actually do have quite easy access, which is why she talks about it with the mind. And I think what she talks about particularly is being able to kind of simple things, even like bursting clouds and things like that. and I would say it's one of the things I started with because I thought it'd be the most interesting and impressive when I was a kid, so why not? But I think the thing that's interesting, and I can't know this is more hypothesis, I guess, but when you look at the history of this country, going back a long way, is as much as we do not know that much about the Druids, the stories we do know or are aware of is, of course, does include weather magic. And I think what they did is kind of build a foundation which we have been able to draw on, which is what quite an easy thing to do. Now, if you ever look at there's a text, an Elizabethan text called Minerva Britannia, and Minerva Britannia includes a lot of woodcut of images and underneath very short poems. Now, some of them are duds, some of them are about kingship, and some of them are about magic. And there is this one particularly which has Minerva Britannia / Elizabeth holding a wand towards the south, a hand towards the sea, and basically summoning the storm. So I would definitely say take a look at that if you can. There's a wonderful copy that was developed by Quarea Publishing, which it's really fun to kind of go through, actually, just because it's all a puzzle. So you kind of go through these little kind of magical puzzles. You've got to decide which is the duds, which are the interesting things, which are just about kingship, which are about, or there's lots going on in it, but it's quite fun, almost like an occult Sudoku, I guess. So to kind of draw this side of it together, of the talk, that you can very clearly see that we take in from things like meditations and visionary magic and all this stuff, that we hone our minds to use this as an instrument in our magical work. Now, in ritual, as I mentioned, it's often, that's how we kind of externalize it. You're doing physical actions to externalize. Ritual does not have to be ceremony. I would distinguish those terms. You can do both, it doesn't make a difference, but ritual is just physical. So that's even lighting a candle. Now, I think most of us here who practice would say that that's probably, actually, without us even thinking, one of the most powerful rituals we do, because we are so used to that pattern. The minute you start lighting your candle, the minute your mind goes into the zone, and you're using that trigger. So we have all these things, some ritual, some less ritual, but they all come together in a way that complements each other ultimately. And then we learn what doesn't work, and that's fine too. It's an art, it's a craft, and it should be about learning from failures as well. To move more into instinct, I suppose that is probably more is the reason I wanted to bring this up is, I suppose in some ways you might say instinct isn't so much the mind, but the reason I wanted to bring this up is because it connects into other things. So magic is also connected to our survival skills. It's connected to our instincts very, very heavily. And one of the things that I think that most of us have experienced is the reason we really, some people got into various forms of magical practice because they were just maybe drawn to nature, or they were drawn to something else, or had a mystical experience. But some people were also brought in because they had perhaps oracular experience, a psychic experience, they produced some magic, not really even knowing how they did it. They instinctively knew how to do even a spell. It just kind of came through, and they don't understand how they knew, but they did. And I think that's very important here, because what we actually also have are inner magical powers. Now, this is not about talking about Marvel. I'm not talking about throwing lightning from your hands and stuff like that, but a very simple example, actually, which the reason I use this example is most people have experienced this, even people who do not practice, which is many people to some degree, they might not necessarily talk about it much, but they will have experienced probably an unwanted presence around them. And what they tend to do is they feel the presence very heavily, and it tends to weigh on them. And it causes almost this instinctual thing that you almost shake a bit, and you end up saying, and forgive my language, but you say piss off very loudly to get rid of the spirit, and it tends to work. And of course, what's happening there is your defenses are coming up. You're not questioning it because you're just experiencing it, and you're banishing this being with this kind of inner power. Piss off becomes your incantation, if you like, but it's not a formal incantation. It's not a sort of prerequisite spell. It is just simply a way of shaping your desire at that time to get rid of something that's there. Now, to open that up a bit, we see this with weather magic, as Doreen said as well. Some people just have a real knack with it. There was a medieval term I really love called tempestari, Tempestari actually referred specifically to magicians or witches who specialized at weather magic. And that also shows, of course, when you have this as a vocabulary in a culture, it shows that it was an important sort of stream of magical practice. So weather magic was quite key. And of course, in agricultural sort of traditions and approaches, that would definitely have its place. Famously, Tempestari would be doing things like tying the wind in knots as a famous bit of folklore, and that was to help sailors along the way. And you can even see that going almost to a degree, although albeit with a deity, in stories like the Odyssey, where the winds are bound for Odysseus. But in terms of how this relates to the mind as well, is of course, when I talk about these inner powers, they are sometimes very instinctual, but of course, we do learn to, I would say it's awaken, and I use that word very deliberately. And I use that word deliberately because it's not something you will get a book about to learn. It usually comes through conversations. It passes between bodies, between people, it's a very organic thing. It comes out from nature, from life and experience. It awakens these powers within us. And some people have different ones. It does vary. It would be a different talk, but I spent a bit of time exploring these sort of inner powers from my own experience and other people's experience to kind of draw them up. But another example is one, so I refer to myself when I'm trying to kind of build this up, is when I talk about weather magic in terms of inner power, if you like, something you have a natural affinity to. I refer that as Tempestari. I refer to banishment in terms of what I meant about that kind of encounter with an unwanted spirit when it just kind of comes to you. But another very quick example is one I refer to often as from the Greek as pharmakeia. Pharmakeia is usually translated actually by the Greeks to mean witchcrafters, and that's how we would use it now. In modern Greek, it actually would mean like pharmacy, and it's where we get our word for pharmacy from. But ancient Greek pharmakeia, with pharmakis being the word for witch, was of course because it was so linked to drugs and roots and plants. But some people have a real affinity with that. Some people have green fingers, you might say. Some people just understand the language of plants, and some people learn it. It's quite varied, but I would say that these things are all there. Now, in the yogic tradition, there is an idea of what's called the siddhi. Siddhi are basically powers, but in the tradition, from how I understand it, and I have to be honest, I'm not initiated into this or involved in it enough to know more than I'm saying. But what I would say, how it comes across to me, is that these are powers that people develop, which are a byproduct of spiritual development. So whereas I would say in witchcraft, we're trying to actually awaken and access these powers, it seems to me that in this sort of yogic principle, what they're saying is they're trying to achieve, they're very focused on this kind of higher enlightenment, but along the way, because of that, you end up developing these other powers as well. So you can look that up if you're particularly interested in it. But I would say that most of the time, all this stuff comes up from ritual will help. And ritual helps because you're enacting mythology. You are internalizing power at the same time while you're externalizing it. You know, you're kind of internalizing what you're working with. There's a relationship there. Every time you're practicing magic or working with magic or engaging with magic, which is what we do pretty much through life. We live it. We are kind of in the process of doing that. And as I said, it comes through just through having these kinds of talks even can awaken things, because it triggers memories, it triggers lots of things. You can do it just from talking to friends and conversation. What I would say probably doesn't do it is reading a book of instructional magic. You know, that is there for a different purpose. Certainly art can do it, but that's because we're talking about that kind of vocabulary, the kind of vocabulary that is a deeper element of language. So poetry, arts, all those things, of course, it's not just language on a simple level of denotation. With this sort of language, you have to look at the words on a sort of deeper, more personal and engaging level, which you only get from that kind of engagement. So in dealing with those sides of it, in terms of looking at this as an instrument, in terms of looking at it as a connected to our very being, our instincts, and what we're all part of. The third part that I wanted to go into is hidden depths. And I would say the famous phrase, know thyself, is a very important quality here. And it's something we're always doing. I would say when we're getting into the sort of deeper, hidden depths and deeper elements of magic, you need to see it really as a spiral. If you imagine the tree of life, you shouldn't even see, well, I say you shouldn't, I don't think you should be seeing them as spheres as they're often described. You should be seeing them as spirals. And the reason for that is you can go to different spirals and you go down to the same one and you're on a higher tier of the spiral, but you're still on the spiral. And that's what makes this actually, if anything, so amazing for us, because actually what's happening here is you can never get bored. You can never, we're never going to get there in a single lifetime. It's never going to happen. So if we're able to invent boredom with our craft at any point, that is something you need to think about, because realistically, you can, I suppose if you look at something you've been through that's perhaps been difficult in your life, and then you kind of get past it, yes, you rise above it, but you do find it tends to come back and you have to deal with it again in a different way. And this is the same sort of principle. Now I'm going to give a very brief quote from Marcel Proust, which is a wonderful one, which I think most people would even know, which is, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in, how do I phrase that? But in having new eyes. And I think that's kind of a significant point. That is that thing of, certainly new landscapes are great, I wouldn't want to criticize that, but it's this idea of how we actually see our landscape, how we engage with it. Often in magical, if you're a practitioner of magic, you are living it, and you are therefore, you're kind of in a way, and into different depths and different times of your life, you're between the worlds all the time. When you walk your landscape, you are living its past, its present, and its future. You're aware of what has happened there, you're aware of what's happening, and you can reach out to its future because you know its seasons and its shifts and its changes. And it's the same with the mind in many ways. Now, you may or may not have heard of an anthropologist called Adolf Bastian. Adolf Bastian was a German anthropologist who came up with an idea called elementary ideas that in time would move over to someone like Carl Jung, who would come up with the collective unconscious. Now, the reason I think that's a significant shift actually is elementary ideas are very interesting, and it's the same thing really. It's this idea of almost like an archetype. But essentially, the reason I think it's a significant change in vocabulary is elementary ideas obviously makes you think of the mind. Idea is mind, but collective unconscious is the depths of the mind. Unconscious is more than just an idea. It's something that's more often hidden. And there's a lot of creative power that we can connect in by tapping into the deeper unconscious. And often today, I think people talk about this a lot with terms like shadow work and various other Jungian phrases, which all have their place. But I have to be honest, I also feel it can end up being a situation where you end up just focusing on the mind. And actually, as I said at the beginning, it should be multidimensional. And I'd think what's very interesting and I think very important is that our inner darkness and our divinity are intertwined. To not see that as something wrong, but something to work with. Now, we see this actually very much in poetry, in art, and in religion. And I'm going to give a very simple example, actually, not within a pagan tradition, but within a Christian tradition, and that is of Catholicism. Because what we have in Catholicism is they wear the crucifix, they wear the emaciated corpse of their God round their necks. Now, you can obviously look down on that and see it as something bad, but beyond getting past some of the other issues with perhaps that tradition, what they're actually showing there and proving there is the intertwining of darkness and divinity through their understanding of the wisdom of sacrifice. And they wear that around their necks, they have it over their beds, it's kind of everywhere, and that's not necessarily within context a bad thing. It's how you relate to that, and also then how you treat others, which has been a problem. Now, there's a very famous ceremonial ritual which I do not mean to be rude about, but I would disagree with, which is called the Iob Ritual, and that's an acronym: I for identify, O for objectify, and B for banish. And the idea there is they get you to kind of take, let's say, a fear. You then give it a form, you objectify it once you've identified it, and that form is usually sort of classic demonic form, and then you banish it. The reason I would say that's bad again is because what is key to your darkness isn't to banish your darkness. You can't, it's delusional. You integrate with it. You rise above and integrate with it. You take it within yourself. And we see this throughout the language of mythology. When you look at there's an amazing writer who I imagine everyone here will have heard of to at least some degree, Joseph Campbell, who one of the things that he wrote famously the Masks of God, where he talks about the archetype of deity, and he also talks about the hero of 1,000 faces, which is the idea of throughout mythology and stories, the hero treads a similar path, and he looks at how they're an archetype and what they experience and what they have to go through in order to become the hero. And very famously, one of the most modern versions, stories using his model specifically and very actively, was actually the original Star Wars trilogy. George Lucas very much drew from those works, and they knew each other very well. And he actually said the demon that you can eat gives you its power. So again, he's talking about taking it in and integrating with that. We see this in old mythology as well. If you look at an example such as Siegfried defeating the dragon Fafnir, he doesn't just kill it and get rid of its body. He takes in its blood, and then he hears the song of nature. Now, what's sort of significant, I suppose, is Fafnir is specifically a lindworm, and a lindworm dragon is a water dragon. So whenever we're looking at water, quite obviously, we are looking on a magical level. We're talking often life and death and underworld. Obviously, it's ebb and flow. On a psychological level, particularly involving Jung, we're talking about the subconscious. So these are creatures of the subconscious. And what I would say is that we're not, in my opinion, we're not talking about one, we're talking about both. We're talking about it from a mental perspective and a magical perspective. Now, Campbell wasn't a magician. He was a very interesting man and a wonderful, had a beautiful vocabulary and a real spiritual depth, but he wasn't a magician. So sometimes we have to kind of then see it within that lens. And we see this with simple stories like Jonah and the whale. You know, there we have the beast, like a dragon, this huge beast under the waters that represents the deep, strong, massive powers of the subconscious that he is then swallowed by, and until he integrates, is then spat out with that new power and that transformation of consciousness, and integrating the vast powers of that within ourselves. Now, another author of that, who's unfortunately now no longer with us, but a wonderful author in so many ways, was Ursula Le Guin, who wrote Wizard of Earthsea, among many other things. And she was a wonderful writer. And I don't want to ruin the book for people who might want to read it, but I genuinely recommend it. It's full of, it's very much about the integration of darkness. It's about equilibrium in a very sort of almost Taoist way. And it's a beautifully written book. One of the things that I will probably quote from her, which I sometimes write in people's cards, within reason and context of what the card is for. One of the quotes which I really love from her is, she said, "To light a flame is to cast a shadow." And that again is this idea of how, you know, light births shadow, darkness and light have a dynamic balance that we integrate. I'm very much against, for so many reasons, but if I'm honest, mostly racial reasons, using the words black magic and dark magic to mean evil magic. I believe you can obviously have a form of maybe corrupt or tainted approaches to magic, but ultimately dark magic is very real, dense, sweet and heavy. It's not about good and evil in that kind of context. So I'm just remembering where I was up to. And you can think of this also in terms of basic philosophy. Most people will have come across Plato's Republic, and the famous analogy of Plato's cave, you know, where you have shadows on the wall and you think that's the reality. And then when you get to kind of come out the cave and you see there's more to reality than you knew, maybe there's more beyond that. And that is this thing, we're always uncovering, we're always going up the spiral, if you like. So what I'm hoping to kind of grasp at here with the mind is that it's you can use it as an instrument. B, you can work with it in a way that's actually kind of linked to your instincts, linked to your body, linked to very primal forces. And of course, the other part, this last part, is there are hidden depths, and there are powers that go far beyond that are basically almost like our dragons, our demons, that are allies ultimately, once you learn how to rise above some of that. I would say if you can think actually about something that, a fear that has maybe stopped you leaving the house, or a fear that has stopped you making a move. Imagine if that fear was something you could use to your advantage. Imagine if that fear that's motivated you to hold you back could push you forward instead. That's the kind of power that you can have there, and it's accessible. But as I said, it is a spiral, and you do sometimes find you have to face the same demon again in a different way. It's not about this kind of more immature sense of being the kind of thinking yourself a great knight with your sword. Now you can get away with whatever you want, do whatever you want. We're still only ever children. We will only ever know 1%, if that, of magic in a lifetime, because it's way bigger than we are. So, and often I suppose the thing is that most of this stuff is kind of underworld. You know, even in the subconscious, we're going to depths, and I think that is something that is often an issue in magic, is the celestial has become, and should be, it should serve an importance, but I think what's often missing is the underworld current, which was essential in older and more primal traditions of magic and sorcery. And a very quick example is if you look at a deity such as Apollo, who became very linked to be it the god of society and civilization and of the sun. That came a lot later. He was not god of the sun for a long time. Before that, and if you go back to the Iliad, one of the first classical texts, he doesn't come with a golden bow of the sun. He comes with a silver bow. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the moon, but he doesn't come with gold. He comes with silver, and he comes with plague. And what we really see here is a god who is associated with plague, potentially healing, and oracular, hence the Oracle of Delphi, who drew from the earth, not the sun, as well. You know, all these things are interrelated. You know, people often criticize Christianity for messing up, taking pagan gods and turning them into either saints or demons, but they weren't the first to do it. And the classical sort of celestial Olympians sort of do that too along the way. It's why Dionysus, who was worshipped so long ago for so long, ended up being reintroduced later to the pantheon and joining the 12 Olympians. It's a similar kind of pattern. So I really just hope that what we can see here is that there's ways that we, and I think should be, as witches, occultists, all that, we should be seeing the mind as something we can hone and work with, but also seeing that there are things to explore, things to understand within ourselves, and know that that's an ongoing journey, and that should be part of the fun in many ways. Whilst I'm saying honing is almost feels like a very focused work, and it should be. There's an element of this which is focused, but an element of this which should be freedom. There's an element of it that is trance, to let go, to let your mind relax and to submit to power is also very important. And there's a balance there we kind of have to learn, which, depending on our culture, society, and our psychological framework, allows us to do. And in meeting these, it's often by encountering these inner demons that we get to those points of being able to do that, where light meets us, it creates a shadow, and that shadow can move in the darkness, and there you will find power. So that is the end of what I was going to talk about. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Much appreciated. Does anyone have any questions? Hang on. Was that your hand going up, Kevin? Okay, you should be live.
Okay, well, I've just put this into the group chat anyway, but because it's a long one.
Do we need to take notes?
Well, no, only for Richard, really. So, my question: our perceptions do change through time, as for previous. You see, this is probably why it's easier to read it. I'll read it. Our perceptions in relationship to our previous experiences, good or bad, in certain ritual practices change through our lives. Our past, we do have some rose-tinted memories. Sometimes there's some decent rituals, sometimes some bad ones. So what about thoughts on dealing with that baggage when you move on to a new ritual environment? How do we carry those over? How do we transform those worldviews, points of views into a new paradigm?
So I usually find, and it depends, I suppose, on the tradition, but my experience has been, particularly with good magical traditions, is that often our theology, our ritual precedes our theology. So within context, you can work with a group that, let's just say the group you're in is meant to be duotheistic. It believes in a god and goddess generally. And you decide, actually, well, I'm actually more an animist or polytheist. Usually those traditions are like, yes, you can work with this model in a specific ritual setting, but that shouldn't actually affect the fact that you can have opposing theologies. And that's usually because in many ways, all of them are correct in a kind of strange and unbinding way. I think the thing that I find is that sometimes it does mean actually abandoning, where it means it's run its course. And one thing I think is actually important when it comes to traditions is we have to remember that's actually the final externalization of the magic. So it's connected to source. Usually that source will be the same for every tradition. Then you've got your circuit, if you like, and that will potentially vary to some degree. And then you have your light, so it turns on, and then you've got lampshade. The ritual is like the lampshade. Actually, my friend gave this analogy. I was trying to remember where I was getting it from, so I have to credit her for that. The lampshade can be changed. You can use whatever lampshade you want. Same like with a car. You've got your engine, you've got your basic stuff, but you can paint it whatever color you like. It's not to say the tradition isn't useful. We need that for a vocabulary. We need that to, for a very human reason most of the time. It's the engagement. But it does have a shelf life. And that could be hundreds of years, obviously, but it tends to have a shelf life. Now, some traditions might be able to bypass that because of the varying flexibility. But the person also will have a shelf life with it. And potentially they will have to say, actually, this tradition has its... You shouldn't be criticizing this tradition necessarily. You might do, but I think you can move away from it. You can say, actually, I need to be done with this. I need a different path. And the other thing, of course, is that it's got to be the tradition actually works how you're wired. And some people are wired for specific ones over other ones, and some people can just get on with any of them. And that's really another thing, I suppose, is that some people, some traditions are made by people who are wired a very specific way and think everyone should be, and they're not. And it's great for the people that are. They should be joining that. It will work for them, but it's not going to work for everyone. So I would say just have that flexibility and move on sometimes.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you for that, Richard. Anybody else have any questions? Aha, Dylan.
Richard, imagination is such a powerful tool, even just for like creative pursuits outside of a tradition or a practice. But can you talk a little bit about the difference between just imagination in terms of the rambling mind that wanders and plays, say like happens to you when you're just coming out of sleep? You get little glimpses of your dreams, and like it's limitless possibilities. But can you talk about the transition or the differences between that and the application of imagination through will, for an end result, for a goal?
Sure. Well, I think actually they can be few and far between at times, because I think there's a reason magic is often called an art. It's a creative process as well. And when you look at like writers who I mentioned Ursula Le Guin, as far as I'm aware, she wasn't a practicing witch or magician in any sense. I think she still tapped into something very real and magical, very much. And I think people can do that without the title or the pursuit. But the main sort of difference here is, of course, the fact that imagination can run away with you. And what's interesting is a lot of people, including actually, I can't pretend I'm the biggest fan of him, but even Crowley would say to people, do not say when you're having a kind of magical visionary experience, oh, but it was just in my head, it's just imagination. When you start, you kind of, unless it's going to be like stuff you're getting completely from the last television show you watched, it's important just to kind of embrace and accept whatever you're getting, because it will start to filter. And I would say that comes with discipline and time. And that's another example of where this is an art. If you're a painter or a writer or any of that, or a dancer, it doesn't really matter. You learn your tools, and then you do so much with it. But I would say that one of the main things to me And one of the, I think probably one of the biggest blocks to it is, and I don't want to criticize it because some people do believe that and they should, and they're entitled to, but when you have this idea that magic is only a psychological model, when you have this idea that it's like, you know, yeah, because these gods are archetypes, that must mean that, you know, they are, I suppose that's the chaos magic approach, and I think that was an important tradition for its time. All traditions are, as I said, they're human parts. So chaos magic gave a scientific language to magic to a degree. It was experimenting with paradigms, but it was also chaotic. And we kind of have to, it's still a tradition though. They might not like being told that, I suppose, but it is a tradition. And it has its drawbacks. And what I think we're seeing here is, and it happens a lot, is because people then think, oh, the gods are just, you know, they've been imagined into existence. They think there's, whereas what I would say is happening in magic is what you're doing is your imagination is creating the interface. Your imagination is essentially creating with the power, not imposing on it. You are working with it. So when you're working with an energy, so if you look at any deity is just power ultimately. So if you take an energy like I mentioned, Pan, there you're getting nature. Pan is just all its nature. Sekhmet is power, literally means power. And then you start to give it a form that you associate with power. So that's the lioness in the case of Sekhmet. That is the half man, again, another animal element. Because one of the things that I think is a bit of an error, and I think it's probably based around, again, though Christianity wouldn't have helped, it also happened in the classical world to some degree, is I don't think it's about the gods being created in our image, or what they did was they actually engaged with it through the raw elements around them, so through the lightning, through the wind, but also through beasts and these wild animals that surrounded them. And that engagement, I think, is the key. It's to be able to engage with where sort of perception and imagination meet, I suppose, is the key. And that is just through discipline and practice. And some people are just really good at it and other people take more time. And if you aren't very good at it, the thing to do is look to mythology and stories. If you start reading them, it gives you that vocabulary, and in time it starts to bring out, because I think that's the other thing, is that so many traditions, as I said before, like they can pin you down, because the tradition will say, well, this is how we teach it. But actually, if it's not the right tradition for you, if you're really bad at visionary type things and you've joined a group that's all about that, what you need is a tradition that teaches it through stories and ritual, that you will then start to unravel that in a different way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I say hi, Dylan.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Okay, you got a question, Yvonne?
Yeah, it was sort of a remark followed by a question. So the remark is that I am reminded of a quote I came across, I don't know the source, that deities are a vast cosmic process with a possibly anthropomorphic interface. In other words, they are there, they are the power, like what Richard was describing. They're a big stream of power or stream of consciousness, and when we tap into that, we perceive them in our own image, but that doesn't mean that the thing we perceive is all there is. This is exactly what Richard was saying, which is another way of saying it. So my question for Richard is, you mentioned about Joseph Campbell. I mean, I've got to say, I've initially found reading Masters of God really, really helpful. But there's been some criticism of Joseph Campbell about that he was actually a bit right-wing, and he was trying to kind of munge too many myths together into and losing the sort of specifics of how each thing comes out of each culture.
That is definitely something that also people have done, not necessarily his fault, but Jung has done through Jung as well. But all that's actually happening there is we're seeing patterns, and actually it's a really good example of we see this with correspondences. Correspondences are really useful. What they should do is they should inspire you to see patterns, and they should inspire you to see as a guideline, but actually they should not replace the mythic language that they come from. And it's the same with this. You're absolutely right. As much as I appreciate Joseph Campbell, he was still a professor in a very specific society. What's interesting is when you see interviews with him towards the end of his life, because of course as people get to the end of their life, they unravel a bit, and you start to see really interesting aspects and elements of them, and things shift and change. But I would agree that it should never be about, when we see an archetype, you could say, you could say a nurse that you know is an archetype of a caregiver. They're human beings, but they can still be an archetype in that kind of regard. But it should not mean that they are all the same thing. That nurse is not every other caregiver. We would know that very obviously as human beings. It should be the same. Gods, you're absolutely right. You know, with deity, we can see common patterns, and sometimes we can even obviously historically link them back. We can actually see that actually they borrowed this from there. If you look at we see this a lot in the magical Greek papyri, of course, where they literally take gods and mash them together. And that was mostly political, a lot of it, from what I can see. So that varies. But I would agree and think it's very important that as modern people in a world where we do have to bypass the inherent racism, which isn't necessarily hate crime racism, but there is going to be the racism in the fact that they're seeing it through a Western lens, if you like, as we see in Fraser's Golden Bough as the best example of that. You know, that's heavily criticised for similar reasons, and probably with much more vehement and for good reason.
Absolutely, and also the colonial assumption that we have a right to every piece of myth or piece of ritual or piece of culture.
Absolutely.
Which the indigenous people in Canada will happily tell you to take a hike.
Absolutely, and they would be entitled to, and I think that's
absolutely, yes.
Yeah, it's completely valid. We should be certainly we can sort of make a study and we can respect it, but ultimately we can't know it. And I think if you're involved also, if anyone here is involved in a mystery tradition, you wouldn't like if it was that when it's done to your tradition. You know, no one wants to hear you know, taking out of the context of that. So ultimately, like I said, you can see certain patterns and you can see certain similarities, but there's always going to be distinction.
Yeah.
And
Lovely.
that.
Thank you for that question, Yvonne, and thank you for your answer, Richard. I see that Jennifer's waiting to pose a question.
Unmute myself. Can you
That's
hear me?
it. Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you for that, Richard. That's absolutely fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. My question really is, I was fascinated by some of the things you said about ritual, which is obviously a big research concern of mine. And I don't know if you're familiar with Graham Harvey's work, and he talked about ritual not just within a pagan context, but partially within a pagan context, as the enactment of relationality, rather than necessarily being something that is connected to belief. And I liked the way that you talked about ritual, and also what you said about embodiment, which I think is really important, that magic and ritual is not just about the mind, that it's also an embodied thing. It's something that you experience with your whole person, not intellectually. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the interface of imagination and ritual. And I wondered if you could just say a little more around this idea of embodiment of ritual and what you see the purpose of ritual being.
Sure. So I would say that also there's different kinds, and I think that's a very important point, because to me, magic is also this thing of it's how you're engaging. So you can have a devotional relationship with a deity, or you can have a magical one, but they're not the same thing. And this is because we have a massive issue within our language of with Christianity, because of course that's our general vocabulary. So people talk about worship and submission, whereas I think to pagans it would mean something else. It's that interrelation issue, and not for all Christians again, because that can vary. But in terms of getting to the heart of your question, I guess, is that the purpose for ritual, for magical ritual, I would say, is it's about developing a working relationship, I suppose, with various powers. And then within that, what you're doing is you are your physical action is, so you can some rituals are actually they're patterns, I guess, aren't they? There's, you know, they have a specific pattern to follow. And some are very naturally connected to that power, because it's almost like you're switching on a switch. The circuit's been made, so all you have to do is switch on the switch, and then you start doing the actions, and it all comes to life before you. And that can be useful, because that means you can actually engage your mind on the experience in that way. But equally, there's ones which you are actually often doing some visionary work whilst you're doing ritual, and that can become a very dynamic relationship. Sometimes you're doing it, sometimes you're not having to do it, and you learn that along the way. And I think that what we're also doing, for example, so if I give a very simple example of a lot of people, not everyone, they will have something which is like casting a circle, or they might have a different vocabulary for it, but it's something of that situation, which is usually to mark out a sacred space, to contain power, to preserve it, to protection is a quality of it, but it's actually, I would say, more about the space itself, to create a space between worlds. And what I would say you're doing is often you would draw power from your environment, from the earth and from within yourself, and you give it a shape. So if you imagine that you are doing that, however many times you're doing that, let's just say once a month, twice a month, you're doing this, give yourself a couple of years, and what you've done is you start to see you have a kind of muscle memory, like dance, and that's where you're embodying it. And it is practice that does it. When I was doing Tai Chi, I found it took me over a year before I started to realize the power at play. I couldn't, until I finally got it, it wasn't working. And you're basically, what that means though, in reality, if you do that with casting a circle, is you are teaching yourself how to take in and shape power to a specific, and give it a specific shape. Now, when I say shape, I don't just mean the shape of the circle, but the purpose. So imagine then, 4 or 5 years from now, that means you can just do that and give it any shape you want. That could be for healing, for love, for protection, doesn't matter. But you can then, you have taught yourself through physical movements, through the ritual formats, to take in that power. If you do things where you take in deity, you're at some point you realize that you can pretty much give messages from deity at any time. And usually how that comes through at first is it kind of naturally comes from, you don't even know where it came from. And then in time you develop a relationship where you can almost just think of this deity or spirit, whatever you're working with, and it will be present within you, and it will give you its words. It will produce almost miracles for you. One of the gods I'm really intrigued by is Dionysus. And one of his names is Thaumaturgos, which means wonder worker. And he gave his followers magical powers, essentially, very famously. And I would say it's a similar kind of experience. You are taking these forces within yourself, as when you're acting this out, you are, and you can see this in some cases where people make it very obvious. If you look at primary cultures, a lot of the time, men have to go through a very harrowing initiation ritual. That's really missing from our current lives, unless you're involved in tradition that happens to do initiation. It's really missing. It puts boys through something they really need to teach them to serve nature, essentially. And usually that means going into the womb of the goddess, going into the cave, and having quite a harrowing experience, sometimes more harrowing than I'd be prepared to take on, I grant you. Women, from what we've seen, there's less evidence, but what seems to be the case is they usually, because initiation to women happens through menstruation a lot of the time, and that obviously happens to women, you don't get a choice. So that transformation is present, and then they go to a place like a tent, like a hut, where they learn, I suppose, you reflect on being a reflection of the earth goddess herself. Life and death flow through you. And I think that is really missing, and I think different rituals do different things. So those sort of rituals are much more about society, place, and position. Magical rituals are about relationship, engagement, and taking in power, being part of power. And I think the first test there is not having a messiah complex and thinking you are the power, but knowing you're connected to the power. And humility is really important. I've made so many mistakes in magic, and I always have to tell people that, because it's how you learn so often, and I find, you meet a lot of people who talk about how good they are. I still don't think I'm very good. It's really about improvement and constantly being able to hold your hands up and say, still human, I fucked up, I need to learn, I need to grow. And you see this even in ancient Egyptian texts like the Book of Gates, where you can't get through a certain gate unless you can actually kind of say, yeah, sorry, I messed up, I'm still learning. And it clearly shows that that kind of shedding of part of your ego is needed. I'm not a big fan of getting rid of ego entirely. I think it's, because that's earthy, isn't it? I still want to be connected to the earth. But to me, you are enacting myths which do speak to us on a very primal, very real level. You know, we all have our dragons, we all have our demons, we all have our quests, you know, and then we have our swords. Literally, in some traditions, you literally get a magical sword. You know, we have these tools, be they within us or external or both, and we take those in. And as you learn to externalize some of this stuff, you develop a relationship internally, and you realize you can actually draw that sword in your mind. You can, you know, you can call up a cloak of invisibility, of sort of concealment wherever you are, or power wherever you are, because not because it's about saying, because I think that there is a clash of saying, oh, it's all in my head anyway. It's not just in your head. It's the fact that the relationship is within you as well as outside of you. So you can draw off it wherever you are, but it's in both. It's not just in one or the other. Have I missed anything in your question? Because it was a very interesting question.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. It's really good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Jennifer. It's a really good question, as Richard said. Okay, do we have anyone else waiting to pose a question? Zachariah. Let me just unmute you.
Hello,
Okay.
Richard. Thank you very much for your talk.
Hey.
I was wondering where you think the role of psychology is in magic. So obviously, kind of, it's not everything. It doesn't describe the entire experience or the entire process. But kind of as psychology develops and becomes more complex, we're kind of moving away from kind of Jung and the collective unconscious, and we're starting to kind of like the biological model is kind of like growing, and imagination is seen kind of like as part of our kind of evolution to do all sorts of different things. So where do you think magic fits in with kind of the modern development of psychology?
The model of psychology, which I think is probably the most important, is multidimensional psychology. Is seeing it in all of them. I don't think we should be giving up on Jung. I think Jung is actually right about a lot of things. I think we do have minds, even if you're not religious. And you can see this with people who are atheists, who get very passionate about it, and in various ways. I mean, my friend who's not particularly passionate about being an atheist, I can see his religious thinking at times, and I find it very interesting. I think the other thing also is that I would say with Jung, the issue isn't actually Jung himself. He was fascinating and interesting. It's more almost like a Nietzsche thing. You know, some people think he was a Nazi because of what his sister did. It's where people have maybe taken his work sometimes, and we've got some wonderful Jungian psychologists in various magical traditions who know their shit. But what I think is important, I think psychology totally has its role. The problem isn't that I think it's very obvious that it does. I think the problem isn't where to find that, because I think it's in all of it. It's in being able to how we analyze, how we use these tools. It's in the fact that what we do have in a lot of modern thought is just restricting magic to psychology. Yeah. That I think is the problem. It should be part of it, but not restricted to it. But of course, what you're also saying here is, you do get models of psychology that are biological, chemical. We look at it that way as well. If you can adjust the scope to that, then you start to come outside of of the scope of psychology, but not in a way that stops it being a relationship. And that's what magic does. Magic is in everything. So you can have a magical relationship with your technology. You can have a magical relationship with deity. You can have a magical relationship with plants. You can have a magical relationship with words, with everything, including these models of working. But again, I would say that I suppose all these models in every discipline do the exact same thing I mentioned that traditions do in magic. It gives us a vocabulary. It gives us a structure to work with. And I think you would see this yourself based on your own work, but there comes a point in which you understand the mind in a way that isn't necessarily going to be restricted to that model, and so you work the way you need to work. and that is a key feature. Like that, I think is the point. It's not that it's very clearly there. I think Jung has some really interesting points about archetypes. We just can't restrict it. He has really good points about shadow work, but we just shouldn't romanticize it the way that I sometimes see certain people are doing, in this sense of, oh, I'm really good at doing shadow work, and I have dealt with my demons and all of this sort of stuff. You should have been able, it's about being able to have some humility with that. But it's a very key part of it. Psychology is going to be very important because that's what gives us our mental models and structure, and a structure to it for us to kind of work with, which is what traditions do. So I don't think there's a problem with any of it beyond restricting it, which I don't think so many psychologists would actually do, because I think psychologists understand psychology. The problem is more, I think, from people who don't understand psychology necessarily, or and maybe some do. I can't talk for all of them, but I think that it's really just not. It's about the restriction to it. It's about not having just a psychological model. If you only have a psychological model of magic, then you miss the fact that, hang on, why is my temperature increasing right now? Oh, hang on, I'm calling on a fire goddess. She's increasing my temperature physically to show me her presence in a physical way. But now I'm also can feel, on a psychological level, I can almost see this lioness type figure. You kind of are dealing with all of those models. That's ultimately what I think it's about, if I'm honest. It's about magic being physical and spiritual and mental, all over the place. It's sort of all encompassing.
Yeah.
Okay, are you happy with that, Zachariah?
I am. Thank you very much, Richard. Cheers.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, I'm conscious that we're now at nearly 4:10. Does anyone have any final questions? Oh, Yvonne, hang on.
Yes. So, Richard, thanks, Emlyn. Richard, while you were talking about our relationship with the darkness and the unconscious, you mentioned that Sigurd, when he slew the dragon Fafnir, then drank the dragon's blood. And it gave me an idea for a spell, so I just wanted to run it past you.
Please do.
So I was thinking, right, so a lot of people do a spell where they write their negative quality down on a piece of paper and then they put it in the fire and burn it. And that's never worked for me. So I was thinking, actually, and based on what you said, what if you got some food, probably something that you'd baked yourself, and then imbued that food with the quality that you were trying to transform, and then ate the food and digested it into a new form? Is that the sort of thing you had in mind?
To ritualize it, yes. I think the other thing you could also do is add it to something like wine, because that's such a transformative substance and it's blood-like. But yeah, absolutely, that's the kind of way you could ritualize it. And of course, what I love about what you've actually done is you've kept it very simple, but equally there's a craft to it. When you're baking, when you're making stuff, it's a craft, and we are putting things into it. Food and drink are part of that. If
it's something you could knead, like if you're trying to get rid of your anger, you could knead the bread and get all your anger into that.
And then you transformed it into something else, which you then take in, knowing that your anger is your anger. It's not going anywhere, but you're adjusting to how you can, because anger can be such an amazing engine, right?
It's really useful, but I am definitely not getting rid of anger, but it's channeling it into something more useful and
100%. I think that's really interesting. But yeah, absolutely, that sort of thing is a really good way of ritualizing that.
Cool. I'm going to give that a go and let you know how I get on.
Let us know, Bob.
Okay, on that note, I would just like to remind everybody, well, first of all, thank you all for attending and taking part. It's been a really good start to the proceedings, a series of talks. I would ask you to keep your diary free on the 6th of June at 8 p.m, when our very own Jennifer is going to be Our next speaker, you can register on the website for Pagan Studies, centreforpaganstudies.com, as you did indeed for this one. And unless anybody's got any vitally important questions, we'll do this meeting to an end.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Richard. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Pleasure. Thank you.